Thanks a lot. I'm Alex Byrne from MIT. It's great to be at a conference where, but your view is crazy, is not viewed as an objection. Seems to be viewed as some kind of compliment, actually. So we arranged these talks in order of increasing implausibility. So of course, Ricardo is last. But I think my talk at least follows on nicely from Fiona's and Heather's. So here's the standard picture of three kinds of perceptual experience, which Fiona complicated, but I don't think those complications are really going to affect what I want to say. Actually, they might even help strengthen what I want to say. So the first case is veridical perception. Here is a banana. I'm having an experience as of a yellow banana, and indeed a yellow banana is before me. That's a case of veridical perception. Incidentally, as you might have noticed, philosophers of perception are very inventive when it comes to examples of perception. You know, it used to be perceiving an apple, and then sometimes you get perceiving a tomato. And I think Heather was the one who introduced the banana as an important innovation in the intellectual history of these things. Anyway, that's veridical perception. And then there's illusion. So here I am again, having a visual experience as of a yellow banana before me. I am indeed seeing something. There is a banana before me. It's just blue, not yellow, and for some reason, we needn't go into, the blue banana looks yellow. So here I'm not perceiving the banana as it is. I am perceiving the banana, but I'm getting some of its properties wrong. That's a case of illusion. And then hallucination is the case where I'm not perceiving anything at all, at least in the sense that there is nothing relevant before my eyes that's affecting my retinas. Nonetheless, I seem to see a yellow banana. Okay, so the topic of this session is hallucination, so I should say something about hallucination. Actually, the talk is going to be mostly about illusion, but as you'll see, there's given a highly controversial assumption, there's a connection with hallucination. So Ricardo and I, as Heather briefly mentioned, have defended what we call a gerrymandered object theory of hallucination, or GOTH, and this effectively reduces hallucination to a kind of illusion. So now, if that's right, then we just have two cases to consider. And the basic idea is that when I hallucinate a yellow banana, let's put it in the simplest possible terms, it's more complicated. When I hallucinate a banana, what's actually happening is that I am aware of a physical object. Indeed, it could be a perfectly ordinary banana. It's just a banana out of the many bananas that I have seen before in the past. So as it were, I am reperceiving a banana which certainly existed in the past. Maybe it exists no longer because I ate it, but nonetheless, I'm aware of a physical object when I'm hallucinating. So hallucination, according to us, is a kind of illusion, because even though I may be getting the real banana's color and shape right, I'm certainly getting its location wrong. Maybe the banana is no longer around in any event. Even if it is around, it is not in the scene before my eyes. Of course, the theory has to be much more complicated than that, because we can hallucinate dragons and unicorns, and no one has ever perceived a dragon or a unicorn because there aren't any. But anyway, let's move on. Now, our theory is a radically extrinsic account of consciousness, and it's, because of that, hospitable to naive realism. So Heather is an example of a naive realist who thinks that consciousness isn't just a matter of what goes on in the brain. She thinks that a lifelong brain in a vat, who, let's suppose, is a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of Heather's brain, nonetheless wouldn't be having the same sorts of experiences that Heather is having. Now, we actually go further than Heather. On our view, a lifelong brain in a vat would experience absolutely nothing. All really would be dark within. That was the view that Heather mentioned, and which she said was very implausible. But as I said, the talks are arranged in order of increasing implausibility. Anyway, so that's our theory is hospitable to naive realism. Nonetheless, I'm skeptical about naive realism, and so this is the rest of the talk. So what is naive realism? Here I have a slightly different take from Heather, but I think our differences are not so important. The term actually goes back, as far as I can make out, to the 19th century. Here is a long-forgotten philosopher, Wolff, in 1909, describing naive realism as the cognitive attitude of the so-called plain man. And here is a much more famous, well-known quotation from Bertrand Russell in an inquiry into meaning and truth in 1940, characterizing naive realism as a more restricted version of the thesis, that it's the cognitive attitude of the so-called plain man. We all start from naive realism, Russell says, i.e. the doctrine that things are as they seem. We think that grass is green, that stones are hard, and that snow is cold. And then he goes on in a particularly famous couple of sentences, naive realism leads to physics, and physics, if true, shows that naive realism is false. Therefore, naive realism, if true, is false, therefore it is false. Okay, so this is not actually naive realism as we know and love it today, as was apparent from Heather's talk. This is a weaker thesis than the contemporary version of naive realism. The contemporary naive realist agrees that grass is green, that stones are hard, and that snow is cold, but goes further. And of course, the contemporary naive realist disagrees, takes issue with Russell's two-sentence argument at the end. I learnt from Anil Seth yesterday that the writer Anais Nin is not a naive realist. So here's a quote from her that he gave. "We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are." She's not a naive realist in Russell's sense, hence she's not a naive realist in the contemporary sense. Now, what's the intuitive starting point for the naive realist? Well, I think it's this. So in ordinary cases of perception, where you've got a normal perceiver with a well-functioning set of perceptual systems, let's just concentrate on vision because everyone does, but the thesis is not supposed to be restricted to vision. You've got good viewing conditions, say daylight, you've got a typical scene, no funky objects, just jars of olives and blood oranges from Sicily and bananas and stuff like that. And in that kind of situation, you're aware of how the environment is. You're aware of objects in the scene, their properties, the relations they stand in to other objects in the scene, and nothing else. Reality is just laid bare. There it is. There's the scene. There's absolutely nothing else that you're aware of. Okay, that's the intuitive starting point. And if I was in charge of philosophical terminology, which I certainly should be, then I would call this thesis naive realism, because on the one hand, it's certainly realist. In ordinary cases of perception, you see things as they really are. And it's also, to some extent, naive in that you could persuade, I think, the plain man or the plain woman, or many plain men and plain women, that it's true. Obviously, you couldn't persuade hardly anyone in this room that it's true, but that just shows that there are very few plain men or plain women in this room. Okay, so that's the intuitive starting point, but the contemporary version goes further, and here are 3 quotations from Mike Martin, who's a prominent defender of naive realism. The naive realist wants to claim that when a subject is perceiving, veridically, then the fact perceived is itself made manifest to the subject. Okay, that's so far so good. And then he goes further, and is constitutive of his experience. Here's the second quote. When one is veridically perceiving, the objects of perception, as it might be the banana, Heather mentioned this, are constituents of the experiential episode. The banana is a constituent of the alleged experiential episode that occurs when I'm looking at it, in much the same way that when Heather and I are having a conversation, that's something that occurs, some conversational event, and it's natural to think that both Heather and I are constituents of it. The given event, this is somewhat an additional thesis, the given event could not have occurred without these entities existing. And then there's a thesis about phenomenal character. External things such as trees and the properties which they can manifest to one when perceived determine the phenomenal character of one's experience. Okay, and then there's another theme, anti-representationalism. So Heather already mentioned representationalism. I'm going to say a little bit about that in a sec. So here's a quote from Craig French and Ian Phillips in the course of defending a version of naive realism. Naive realism is the view that the conscious character of experience in genuine cases of perception is constituted, at least in part, by non-representational perceptual relations between subjects and aspects of the mind-independent world. Okay, so what is representationalism? So, Anil Seth had a helpful locution yesterday, the brain's best guess as to the external environment, and I think that's useful in explaining the basic idea of representationalism. So if we contrast veridical perception with a corresponding case of illusion, I seem to see a yellow banana, but really there's a blue banana before me, then the representationalist says, well, on the one hand, the brain's best guess as to the nature of the environment is the same both times. There's a yellow curved object before you. And second, that this best guess filters up to, as it were, or constitutes the conscious character of your experience. The brain's best guess, there's a curved yellow object before you, that forms and contours and shapes your conscious visual experience in both cases. So to slightly mimic the language on the previous slide, according to the representationalist, the conscious character of experience is constituted by the brain's best guess about the layout of the perceiver's environment. And of course, in the illusory case, it's an illusion precisely because the brain's best guess is wrong. Okay, so then we've got a bunch of themes connected with naive realism. There's the emphasis on veridical perception. There's the claim about constituency. Facts or objects are constituents of the experiential episode, at least in the veridical case. We've got a claim about phenomenal character. It's determined by external objects and their properties, at least in the veridical case. And then we've got anti-representationalism. And with respect to constituency and phenomenal character, I think this is something of a distraction. In fact, French and Phillips, card-carrying naive realists, basically deny the claim about phenomenal character, so that doesn't really seem to be essential to naive realism. And in any case, here I'm drawing on some work of Heather, it's unclear why the representationists couldn't agree with the claim about either the claim about constituency or the claim about phenomenal character. So I think naive realism is really best understood as a thoroughly anti-representationalist thesis, which you can think of as the naive starting point extended to all perception, including illusion and indeed including hallucination, if Ricardo and I are right. So when one perceives, even if I'm perceiving what is in fact a blue banana, although it looks yellow, when one perceives, one is solely presented with elements of one's environment, according to the naive realist. In all cases of perception, saying that one is deceived by one's senses is, to quote the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid, is to lay the blame where it ought not to be laid. Or to quote the contemporary naive realist Bill Brewer, error, strictly speaking, given how the world actually is never an essential feature of experience. So this means that, if it's right, that the representationalist is wrong, because the representationalist thinks that in the case of illusion, what's going on is that the brain's best guess, which constitutes your conscious experience, is in error. It's wrong. So error, strictly speaking, is an essential feature of experience, according to the representationalist. It's not, according to the naive realist. Now, again, if I was in charge of philosophical terminology, then I would borrow a typographical innovation from David Chalmers and call this naive realism plus and leave naive realism for the weaker thesis, but I'm not in charge. Okay, so how should illusion be understood according to the naive realist? In other words, we focus on the banana, the blue banana that looks yellow. Why, according to the naive realist, does the banana look yellow? Now, the representationalist has an answer. It's that the brain's best guess is that the banana is yellow. It's falsely represented as being yellow. And the naive realist, well, that depends very much whom you ask. So there are many different answers from different naive realists. I'm going to concentrate on the answer given by Bill Brewer in an influential book and series of papers. Okay, so here's one way Brewer has of explaining his key idea. The italics are his. Perceptual experience is a matter of a person's conscious acquaintance with various mind-independent physical objects from a given spatio-temporal point of view and in certain specific circumstances of perception, such as lighting conditions. Now, that might sound as if it's compatible with representationalism, and indeed I think it is compatible with representationalism, and I'm going to go on to suggest that once you work through Brewer's view, at least if it's to remain plausible, it's got to be compatible with representationalism, so he's not really offering us an alternative. Okay, so remember what Brewer's task is. Brewer needs to show how the blue banana can look yellow without vision falsely representing it as yellow. He's got to give some alternative account of how the blue banana can look yellow. So let's see how he does that. Okay, so his tactic is to give an account of an object looking a certain way, for example, looking yellow, or looking to be moving, or looking elliptical, in a way that makes it clear that the blue banana can look yellow, even though representationalism is false. That's his strategy. So here's his initial formulation. O looks F, the banana looks yellow, if and only if O, say the banana, has, in the circumstances of perception in question, visually relevant similarities with paradigm exemplars of F, as it might be yellowness. Okay, so now I need to explain this jargon of visually relevant similarities and paradigm exemplars. And just to prefigure the worry, it's crucial for Brewer's project that the explanation of these technical locutions, visually relevant similarities and paradigm exemplars, don't itself involve the notion of an object's perceptually looking some way. In order for his project to work, he has to give a reductive account of O looking F. And the worry is going to be that Brewer hasn't discharged that obligation, and the only way of really understanding one of these terms, in particular the visually relevant similarities one, is going to be by appeal to the notion of looks, the very notion that he's giving an analysis of. Okay, so here's visually relevant similarities. Visually relevant similarities, he says, are similarities by the lights of visual processing of various kinds. Thus, and very crudely, visually relevant similarities are identities in identities in such things as the way in which light is reflected and transmitted from the objects in question, and the way in which stimuli are handled by our visual system, given its evolutionary history and our shared training during development. We'll come back to that. What are paradigm exemplars? Well, very roughly, they are instances of the kinds in question whose association with the terms for the kinds partially constitutes our understanding of those terms, given our training in the acquisition of the relevant concepts. They are paradigm exemplars for the kinds in question relative to our grasp of the concepts for those kinds. Okay, that's all a bit wordy, but the basic idea is that this banana, seen in good light, is a paradigm exemplar of yellowness because you could introduce someone to the English word yellow or the Italian word giallo by exhibiting this banana and saying, look, that's an instance of yellowness. A yellow object that looks green, for example, is not a paradigm exemplar of yellowness. Even though it is yellow, you couldn't use the yellow banana that looks green to teach someone what the English word yellow or the Italian word giallo meant. Okay, so now this is the first worry for the intrusion of looks into the explanation of these technical terms. A yellow cube under blue light is not suitable for learning the word yellow. So it's not a paradigm exemplar of yellowness in Brewer's sense. Now, why not? Or to put it another way, why is a yellow cube in daylight a paradigm of yellowness? Why is that something that you could use to teach someone the meaning of the word yellow? Well, intuitively, the obvious answer is, well, because it looks yellow, right? The cube on the top looks yellow. The yellow cube on the bottom doesn't look yellow, it looks green. That's why the cube on the top is the paradigm of yellowness and not the cube on the bottom. But that, of course, can't be Brewer's answer because he can't appeal to the very notion that he's supposed to be analyzing. Now, Brewer has recently revised his account of paradigms in a way that does, at least arguably, solve that problem. He says that paradigm Fs are actual examples of F in situations in which the perceiver may be visually acquainted with their Fness. To put it another way, they're instances of the observable Fs in situations in which the perceiver may be acquainted with their Fness. So again, this is a bit of technical jargon, visually acquainted with, but at least arguably you could explain what it means without presupposing the notion of looks. At least assuming that acquaintance with an object's Fness, assume acquaintance with an object's yellowness in the case of the banana. If that can be explained without appeal to looks F, then this solves the problem that I was just raising. You can explain the notion of paradigm exemplars without smuggling in the notion of looks. Now, if you plug in Brewer's revised version, a revised account of what it is to be a paradigm exemplar, into his account of looks, then you get the following. An object O looks F if and only if either A, the perceiver, is visually acquainted with the object's yellowness, let's say, or O has, in the circumstances of perception in question, visually relevant similarities with F objects, yellow objects, in situations in which the perceiver may be visually acquainted with their yellowness. Okay, so now let's turn to visually relevant similarities. And he says some things about visually relevant similarities. He gives some examples of visually relevant similarities, which certainly gives the impression that you could explain what visually relevant similarities are without smuggling in the notion of looks, the notion that he's supposed to be analyzing. So he says, for example, a round disk looks round from straight ahead in good lighting conditions because from that point of view and in those circumstances, it has visually relevant similarities with paradigm exemplars of roundness. It looks elliptical from an angle because, from that point of view, it has the following visually relevant similarity with paradigm ellipses. It projects an elliptical image onto a plane perpendicular to the viewer's line of sight, in other words, the fronto-parallel plane. So that makes it sound as if, at least as far as the perception of shape goes, it's the projection onto the fronto-parallel plane that's the visually relevant similarity. And so he's told us what the visually relevant similarity is, and he hasn't used the word looks in doing so, so far so good. It looks, maybe it seems as if he's going to be able to give an account of visually relevant similarities without using the notion of looks. Okay, unfortunately, if that's really what he meant by visually relevant similarities in the case of seeing a circle or seeing an ellipse, then it has the result that a head-on ellipse is going to look circular if its elliptical projection, so it projects an elliptical shape onto the fronto-parallel plane, if its elliptical projection is the visually relevant similarity shared with paradigm circles. So suppose the circle, the tilted disk on the right, is a paradigm instance of circularity, a paradigm exemplar of circularity. If it is, then the head-on ellipse on Brewer's account is going to look circular, which it plainly doesn't. It's going to look circular because it has this visually relevant similarity with paradigm circles, namely an elliptical projection in the fronto-parallel plane. So to avoid the obviously wrong conclusion that the head-on ellipse looks circular, Brewer is apparently committed to the view, given what he said about visual similarities, that a tilted circular disk is not a paradigm exemplar of circularity. So in other words, the range of situations in which we can be acquainted with an object's circularity on this view must be very, very narrow when it's viewed more or less head-on, and that is like a totally unacceptable result. It's an unacceptable result by Brewer's lights, in fact. He definitely wants to say that, look, the tilted disk on the right is, in fact, a paradigm exemplar of circularity, because like it intuitively looks circular. I mean, it's like a classic case of perceptual constancy, where despite the fact that the circular disk is not head-on, nonetheless the visual system recovers its actual shape. I mean, that's one reason why it's unacceptable. There are also other reasons. So there's another thing that Brewer could say, a much more plausible thing. He could say, well, you know, all that stuff about projected shape being a visually relevant similarity, that was just a big oversimplification on my part. In fact, it's much more plausible. Sorry, in fact, it's the true story is much more complicated. And he would be right about that, because the explanation of why tilted circles look circular is because there are cues, many other cues, other than projected shape. There's the edge of the disk, which you can see is like tapering towards the top and towards the bottom. There's the texture of the disk. There's the texture of the background. There are shadows, and so forth. There are all sorts of cues, complicated cues, that the visual system can use to recover the actual shape of the disk. Okay, but now it's, as soon as we start getting more realistic about the perceptual psychology, now it's clear that Brewer hasn't really given an account of what a visually relevant similarity is in terms that don't use the notion to be analyzed, namely the notion of looking a certain way. So he says visually relevant similarities are identities in such things as the way in which light is reflected and transmitted from the objects in question. That's what he's thinking of when he's talking about projections on the frontoparallel plane. And then we have this crucial part, and the way in which stimuli are handled by the visual system, given its evolutionary history and our shared training during development. So when you ask for an explanation of, well, just what is the relevant way, or the relevant ways in which circular stimuli are handled by the visual system so that they look circular, or just stimuli of any kind, how are they handled by the visual system in a way that they look circular? Sorry, how are they handled by the visual system? What that means is, how are they handled by the visual system in such a way that the object ends up looking circular? So Brewer's only route to explaining just what these complicated visual similarities are in the case of disks is to use the notion that he's trying to analyze, namely looking circular, in order to explain just what the visual similarities are. So, if we go back to Brewer's formulation, O looks F, if and only if O has, in the circumstances of perception in question, visually relevant similarities with paradigm exemplars of F. Arguably, the prohibited notion of looks doesn't get smuggled into the explanation of what it is to be a paradigm exemplar, but I think it clearly does get smuggled into the explanation of what visually relevant similarities are. So to sum up, how should illusion be understood? Why does the banana look yellow? According to the representationalist, the banana is falsely represented as being yellow, but Brewer's approach, I've suggested, isn't a genuine alternative, and the naive realist needs another theory. Maybe Heather has another theory. But so I can't pretend to have refuted naive realism. Let me end with a slide of a sculpture by the Sicilian artist Giuseppe Veneziano. There you go. Okay, thanks a lot.